Lester, Wushu engineer here. What I'm going to do this morning is really just a short little video clip looking at two different types of strikes. I'm going to be doing those strikes against the load cell. The first strike I'm going to look at is the back fist, and the second strike I'm going to look at is the hammer fist, to see what the differences between the two are in terms of force production or impact force production. Now, of course, there's been a lot of discussion around the videos that I've been posting about the outputs from various devices which have been built to measure striking effectiveness, power, or energy, or force. And of course, these quantities are not all the same, and it's not easy to compare values from one system to values from another system, because striking itself is a very, very, very complex phenomenon and science. And so to do easy comparisons between those systems is essentially impossible. But we believe that there is value in all of the systems that are available out there to measure striking effectiveness and power and force and etc., etc. But each system comes with its own limitations. And the limitations are already based on the limitations of the technology in relation to determining how effective someone's strike is, and on exactly what that technology is actually measuring. Because coming from a traditional martial arts background, I know that there are many, 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 many ways to skin a cat. There's not only one way to affect an opponent. Now, of course, depending on the context of the application of a particular martial art, it may favor a particular way of doing things. And when it comes to striking, it may favor a particular method of generating an effect. If we're talking about, for instance, a comparison between a competition fight and a self-defense scenario, they are very, 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 very different contexts. And techniques and approaches that may work very well in the one context may not work at all, or very poorly in the other context. There's no easy way to transport for instance, a sporting system or approach into a self-defense scenario without modifying it in some way, and vice versa. Certain traditional systems, like my own, really focus on, first of all, on being able to deal with multiple opponents at once. They also deal with working against weapon-wielding opponents. For instance, some of the striking that is that's very heavily practiced within systems that are self-defense based is striking that really involves very little preparation and very little space in which to produce the strike, or the grapple, or the china, or whatever you'd like to call it. Now, the reason for that is obviously because of the context for which it has been designed. In a self-defense scenario, because of the constraints of multiple opponents, weapons, time, other restrictions based on an unpredictable geography and situation, you really have to be able to generate force with very little space in which to accelerate. Whereas in a sports-based scenario, you know that predominantly in sports-based competition-style fighting, you are going to be up against one opponent, and you are going to have a certain space within which to move, and that space is going to have certain characteristics. For instance, perhaps a padded or sprung floor. Those are things that we can't count on in a self-defense situation. So the systems have been developed differently. to suit different context. So that's really just the context of what I'm going to be doing. So the strikes I'm going to be demonstrating back fist and hammer hand. We'll have a look at what kind of forces they produce, and always bearing in mind that that any kind of measurement of any kind of martial technique is always inherently flawed, because you're really taking it outside of the context for which it is, at which it's been developed, and then trying to measure it in a different context. So, for instance, taking the whole example of self-defense versus sports-style fighting, many of the self-defense strikes that I used quite effectively in a self-defense scenario wouldn't really measure very much in when actually performed on any of the systems, really. But within the context of a self-defense situation, those techniques are actually very, very effective. So always bear in mind context, and always bear in mind that inherently any kind of measurement or experimental procedure meant to determine the effectiveness of something is always going to be limited. Okay, so I'll just stop the recording and we'll get straight into the tests. Okay, so I'm going to zero the software and we'll start it going, and we'll start off with a few back fist strikes. Stop that. Okay, so my peak force for the few strikes that I did this morning was 5,467 newtons for the back fist. So we'll just stop that, and just stop the recording, and then we'll try with the hammer hand. Okay, just zero, and we'll start the software running, and I'll try some hammer fist, hammer hand. Stop that there. Okay, so that's interesting. Hammer fist went up to 4930 newtons peak. So I'll just stop the recording there, and we can discuss it a bit later. Alright, so an interesting result. The back fist was clearly, the peak value from the back fist was clearly higher than the peak value from the hammer fist. And consistently so. So I think if we look at the averages, you'll see that that on average the back fist was higher than the hammer fist in terms of the force that the load cell was picking up. So as I was saying earlier, context and what something is used for is quite important, and it's very difficult to, as I said, take something out of context and measure it and say this is better than something else, because although there is and first of all I'll say that my personal feeling on why there is a difference has to do with potential introduction of tension based on the angle of the strike and the angle of my arm and hand as I'm performing the back fist, as opposed to the hammer fist. So in this kind of scenario where I'm striking out that way, having the fist in a neutral position, as in the back fist, introduces less tension into my arm than turning the fist at an angle and then impacting with the hammer fist. So that could actually be why we see an attendant slight drop-off in peak force measured. The other thing that we have to bear in mind is that a back fist has a larger surface area than a hammer fist. So if I was striking with a hammer fist as opposed to a back fist, the hammer fist would actually be concentrating that force within a smaller surface area. So hence the pressure behind that strike increases, and potentially the amount of damage that's done behind that with that strike can also it may also be higher than with the back fist. And of course, we have to understand that within the context of a self-defense situation, the angle of our strike will change depending on our orientation, the orientation of our opponents, and how everything is moving. So it's really if I was, for instance, striking overhead, the hammer fist would be a more neutral position for the fist to be in relation to the arm. So it may introduce less tension into the system than turning into a back fist. But it's the whole rock paper scissors thing. No one beats the other. They have their particular role to play within the context of the situation that they're being applied in. So just an interesting little result, and I'll hope to produce more content soon. And the future videos, I think I'm going to, or at least the very short range future videos that I'm planning, will actually be looking at some other characteristics, potentially reaction speeds, and another interesting project that I have planned. But I'll bring that out soon. So I hope you enjoyed that. Leave a comment in the comment section below, and let me know if you want me to have a look at anything else. Thank you. Cheers.